In this video, we're going to be using SAP Business Objects Data Services to take data from a flat file or a text file and load it into SAP HANA. So the first thing we need to do is to log into Data Services. So we do that by going to Start. We can access that from All Programs, Data Services, and we choose the Data Services Designer. Log in with your credentials. So for me it's student and the password is welcome1, and then it logs you into the system. So in order to import a flat file, we do this in our 7th tab called File Formats. So you can see here, these are all the file formats that we can import. And of course we do it in the flat file folder. So to do this, we right click on flat file and we select new. I'm going to call this file sts_customer orders. And the first thing we need to do is select the file. So if I select by clicking on the file name folder, within my library and within my documents I have a file which is a CSV file called flatfile.csv. So you'll be prompted with a message to overwrite the current schema, so that's fine, so I'm going to click on yes. And by default it doesn't select the first row as the header. It gives you a default list of header names. In order to use the first row as a header, we need to select in our input-output section, skip row header. So we're going to overwrite the current schema with the schema from the file that we've selected. We select yes. And now we can see that the field names have actually changed. Now, the way it works out the field size for all the data types is that it takes the maximum from the and it takes a sample of the existing file. So I would advise that you actually increase this to be a large length, or find out what the actual maximum width of those company names or country names is. If you're not sure, of course, you can make this, you can manually change. So I'm going to change all of these to 50. I'll change month description to 20, and for quarter description I can leave it as it is. Obviously it's spotted that year number, net sales and quantity are all integers. So once we've done that, we can save and close. So what we can do now is just make sure that the data looks okay. So to do this, we right click on our flat file and we select View Data. And if I scan this data, everything looks fine, which is great. So now that we've imported the file, we need to get that data into HANA. So to do this, we're going to build a job and a project. So if I go to my first tab, which is projects, I'm going to build a new project and I'm going to call this file import and click create. A project is just like a folder where all your objects will be stored. Then I'll build a job by right clicking and saying new batch job. And I'll call this again file import. Now a job is what will be executed against the job server. So even though there's nothing in this job, I can execute it by right clicking and selecting execute. I'll be prompted to save all changes and I'll click on yes. And then I can click on OK. All of these options will be explained in another video, so I'm just going to click on OK for now. This is a good thing to do because we're just making sure here that our job server one of the most important components of data services, is indeed working. So we're looking for the message that it completed successfully, and it has. So the next step within the job is to build our data flow. So to do this, I select from the right hand side canvas. Firstly, I double click on the job, and then from the right hand side canvas I select data flow. I select it and then pop it somewhere on my canvas, and I'm going to call this file import. We then double click on our file. So now we need to decide on what is the source of our data, do we need to do any transformations, and what is the target. So to do this, our source of course is going to be our flat file. So we go back to our 7th tab, file formats, and I'm going to drag on STS customer orders and release. We'll then be given an option whether it's a source or a target, and of course it's a source, so I'm going to select source. Of course, again, I can double click on the I can select the magnifying glass just to examine the data. So we also need a target. So as we know, our target is going to be a HANA database. We haven't created the table in HANA. So the best thing we can use is what's called a template table, and we can access this from the right hand side by selecting template table and selecting it on the screen. So I'm going to call this simply file import. It's going to be loaded in a specific data store. For us, my data store will be HANA. We've built that connection before. And I'm going to load it into a schema called STS. And then I'll click on OK. So now what we need to do is add the transform piece. So we can do this adding the most simple one, which is a query transform from the right hand side, and put it in the middle of the source and the target. I then join these up by selecting the output of the source and connecting it to the input of the query, and then from the output of the query to the input of the file. I can then double click on that query. So now what we need to do is load the data into the source data into our query. There's a problem. The source data doesn't have a primary key. So I'm going to show you a simple example of some of the functionality that we can invoke within data services. So we're going to build a primary key. Now of course we could do this in HANA using sequences, and there's lots of programmatic options using calculation views. But the focus here is to do this in data services. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to right click on my target schema and select new output column. And I'm going to call this load ID. And this is going to be an integer and a primary key, because of course we want this to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on and so forth. So then I'll click on OK. So now that we've got this load ID, we need to define what we want to be in this column. Remember, this is just the column name and this is the data type. So we have a nice mapping function. If I select load ID, and if I type GEN, I'll get the option to use a data services function. The data services function I'm going to use is gen row number. Essentially generates the row number. This will give us a sequential key for each row. So the first row will be 1, the second row will be 2. So you select it and then close the bracket at the end. And of course we can see that it will be outputted as an integer. So now that we've added that gen row num, we can see if the code we've added is correct. Now just to show you, if I don't add that end bracket and I click on the validate button, it's going to validate that row. Now of course, because I forgot to close the bracket, it's telling me with the red X that we have an error, and it's also telling me what the error is with the red circle with the white X in the middle of it. If I right click on that output and select view, it's telling me that it's expecting some form of end of the code. So of course now if I was to add that back in and validate again, we get no errors found. So now that we've dealt with the primary key issue, remember we need a primary key when we create a table as a column store table. Now that we've added the primary key, we can just select the other columns. So I'm going to select company name all the way to quantity and drag them to the right hand side and let go. So now we have the primary key as well as all the other columns. So now that we've finished with our query, we can go back to our job level or our data flow level. So we've established the extract, we've dealt with the transformation, and we've dealt with the load. So this is the ETL part of the job: extract, transform, load. So the last step is to simply execute the job. So I can do this by right-clicking on the job, clicking on execute, and clicking on yes. I then click on OK and the job executes. So just to check that we have indeed loaded those records, there's a few ways to check. Well, the simplest one is that it says job completed successfully. Well, that's a good start. The second way is to click on what's called the monitor tab, which tells you how many rows have been loaded. And that table had 5,000 rows in it, or the text file had 5,000 rows in it. And of course, one of the last ways we can check is by going to our data flow. And now because we've loaded the table, we have this magnifying glass. So if I select the magnifying glass, which is connecting to the HANA database, as we can see here, we can see the data in HANA. Now, of course, if I go and launch my SAP HANA Studio, what we should see is that there's a table called File Import now, which exists within the HANA database within the STS schema. So to check, if I expand the catalog, expand the STS schema, and expand the tables, we now have a table called File Import, and I can right click on that table and go to Open Data Preview. So we've validated that we've managed to load that data within the SAP HANA Studio. So that's a very simple way in which we can take data from a text file and load it into SAP HANA using SAP Business Objects Data Services.